Ron, I just want you to say, I, pipe down. He wasn't here when Jim Gaskell was, but he doesn't know I'm not afraid to call you by name. All right, grab your Bibles. So what, and it's kind of been funny to me that I've loved the topic, the theme of the study that we're doing all summer. That idea of grace teaching us. I love that idea. And I've been getting credit a lot of weeks whenever people get up to teach. Well, whenever Bo called me, well, yeah, let's be real, okay? Rick came up with it, I call people. So I feel like let's give credit where it is. But I think it is a great topic because the more you think about grace, and I like the way that Kenny defined it the first night that we did it. We talk about the most common, I would say, the most common definition of grace is people talk about an unmerited favor, right? Or things along that line. And really, what is more unmerited than salvation that we have through Jesus? Right? Because that's what grace is, ultimately. And really, what on earth is more unmerited than that? So I love this idea, and I wanted to read the topics that, if I said me, it'd be mostly a lie, a couple that I came up with. But I want to read you the list of things that Rick texted me. This is why you always want to be on a committee with Rick. He says, Bo, I've got an idea. How about grace teaches us? Here's some ideas for some topics we can give people or they can come up with their own. Grace teaches us to say no to ungodliness. Some of these we've already had, some are still to come. Grace teaches us to consider others better than ourselves. It teaches us to forgive as we have been forgiven. I sure don't like that one. It teaches us to surrender all. It teaches us to be grateful. It teaches us to be patient with others. I don't like that one either. Grace teaches us to trust God's promises. It teaches us to live above the world. It teaches us to let go of the world. Two different things, really, if you think about it. It teaches us that God takes us where we are. My wife just texted me. This is why I never bring a phone up here. And I apologize, I'm chewing gum. Ron, whenever Brenda came and sat down earlier and you were trying to get her to the back seat, but she said, no, you're going to sit right here, and you thought nobody knew? I was hoping that would be the only time a man got called out in front of everybody tonight, but it wasn't. And I have a feeling this isn't the last. Thank you, Joni. I'm sorry, I'm chewing gum. It teaches us that God takes us where we are. Grace teaches us obedience to God's will. Grace teaches us to persevere through trials. It teaches us to be faithful. It teaches us to bear one another's burdens. It teaches us to make it our aim to please God. And it teaches us to see the urgency in sharing the gospel with others. And that is Rick off the top of his head. That's a 3-month think about it for me. But I love the topic because whenever you consider grace, when you consider unmerited favor, and that unmerited favor is that we have been saved through the sacrifice of Jesus, is there really a part of our lives that isn't touched by that? And you can call it God's grace, or you can call it salvation. Is there a part of our lives that isn't touched by salvation? Or is there a part of our lives, maybe that isn't, but all parts of our lives should be touched by that, right? And defined by that. So, tonight I don't want to take any of those topics. We're leaving them for the people who are left, the ones that haven't been done. And I just want to talk about grace teaching us. My 14-year-old son, I won't even call him by name, teenagers. I don't know how anybody ever put up with any of them. That's why Cub has a gray beard. Grant is a school student the exact same way I was a school student. And I now understand my mom and dad's frustration. He drives me crazy. And so whenever I think about being taught and how to learn, learning sometimes requires effort on the behalf of the learner, right? And sometimes whenever we don't learn well, you get a whole long summer of push mowing the yard in the heat of the day with no self-propel. To understand, back in my day, we hauled hay, in most of y'all's day. Or we were out in the cotton field. These days, I don't have a farm, they just got to mow. He's like, didn't I mow yesterday? Yeah, but it needs to be mowed again, I think. Hey, don't tape that, and somebody will call the police. But sometimes I've noticed in my life how many times it seems I've run and bumped my head on the same wall. It looks a little different every time, but at the core of it is the same problem. And it's because I've been a little thick-headed as a learner. And I hadn't been willing to accept and to learn my lesson and overcome what I need to overcome, right? So we can move on to new things. So I just want to talk about the idea that grace teaches us, or it doesn't, and maybe what both of those things maybe look like. But I don't want to talk anymore. So I'm going to ask you, like I said, we have all these topics that we've done, but I want to ask you, if you're comfortable sharing, you don't have to share anything that's inappropriate or you don't want to, but can you tell me some times in your life where you can look back and you can see that grace was touching that point of your life, or was affected by that point of your life? Do you understand what I'm asking? Does that make sense? Where your life was shaped or a lesson was learned and you were able to grow and to mature, and it's a lesson that you take forward, but it all stems from God's grace. Yeah, we call that a lifetime, don't it? It's true. Can you narrow it down?
Those that have shaped me have not been necessarily the most positive times of my life. They've been some of the hardest.
Did y'all hear that? She said the things that have shaped her probably the most and the lessons learned, which makes this a hard question to ask and maybe discuss in a place like this, is the lessons that are hardest learned and the ones that hurt the most. I mean, they certainly couldn't do it anymore, but think back to whenever you were in school and whenever I was in school. If somebody did something to somebody else or something like that, what was the thing? I'm going to go teach that person a lesson, right? Now, if I said that in the teenage classroom, they wouldn't have the foggiest idea what I was talking about. Or whatever. You were like, mm-hmm. Have your parents, did they ever tell you, go back to your room? I'll be back there in a little bit. It's time you learn a lesson. Learning a lesson is not always fun. So yeah, sometimes the most valuable lessons are the ones that hurt.
I think it's important too to have people in your life that will shed the light on that grace or help teach you in those teachable moments.
Yeah.
So, I've got a good spouse that's more than willing to teach me in those moments. And friends that will do that too.
And that, I mean, we call that accountability, right? Just having people that help us in life. Is that a nice way to say it? We know the Bible always also teaches us there's a way to lovingly redirect, right, and to shape and to do those things. Let me just ask you this. Let's change the question a little bit. How does grace affect your life? How does God's grace Somebody must be running loose through the parking lot. That's a security team. You know what I'm thinking? What's that old song, Convoy? Some of you know that one. Bunch of bears out there, and they're about to put the hammer down. How has grace affected your life? Salvation, unmerited salvation from Jesus. How has that gift and that grace, how does it affect your life? Affected, how does it continually do that? If it does. It does. Clyde said it gives us great hope in the future. That doesn't take all the pain away from this world, but it sure helps it, doesn't it? It sure helps it.
You have absolute proof of answered prayer.
Did y'all hear that? When you have absolute proof of answered prayer, I would hope all of us could think to a time where we have prayed and been able to see and recognize God's direct answer to our prayers, whether it went the way we liked or not.
Kind of on what Sandra said earlier, in Job it says that we're not supposed to despise the discipline of God.
Yeah.
And James says, of course, to count it joy when we experience trials and difficulties. I think that's the whole Christian experience like everyone's saying, learning from our walk, learning from our experiences, our spiritual ups and downs. And that shapes who we are, and it develops our faith and refines us, as Peter says, tested by fire and we're refined.
Yeah. Isn't it interesting though, whenever we talk about learning and lessons learned and those kind of things, most all of our minds go back to the hard lessons learned. You know what I mean? The ones where we literally have some skin in the game. Boy, that's what you're talking about, being refined by fire. My granddad used to walk around, and that was his quote, kind of pure joy. We'd be out and he'd be hauling hay up in the rafters, 110, he'd be sipping his black coffee. We'd be like, man, Papa, this is kind of pure joy, boy. This is a good. I don't think that's what it's talking about.
Yeah, pure joy because he's watching us.
Yeah, because he was watching us, that's right. And we always thought, why is he sipping hot coffee in the middle of the day? It's 110 degrees outside. Larry, what are your thoughts?
I think about the first time that we see grace extended in the Bible is important to look at. And we see that in Genesis chapter 6, where God looks down, and when we read this verse, you may think, well, how in the world is that showing God's grace? He comes up to Noah and he says, I will bring the flood waters upon the earth and destroy all flesh, in which is the breath of life under heaven. Everything that is on the earth shall die. That's God's grace. You may say, well, that's not right. That's death. But the next sentence says, that I will establish my covenant with you and your family, and you shall come into the ark, you, your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives with you.
It was grace for Noah and his family.
That was the first time that grace is shown to a point of salvation
Yeah.
for mankind. That's the first time that occurred.
Yeah.
But it came upon God destroying wickedness, so to speak, but then allowing Noah to be saved as he taught Noah grace through instructions on how to construct the ark.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's the first time we see grace and how it teaches someone.
And that grace propelled him to spend a little time building.
It goes on to say that Noah did exactly everything that the Lord asked him to do.
So,
But that came about because Noah knew the nature of God, His goodness and His severity.
yeah.
He knew that he could accomplish both things.
And I think that brings a great point, is that Noah went on to be very obedient because he understood, one, that he and his family were saved, that salvation was extended to him, but he also understood what happens away from salvation. So, okay, let's think about that in our own lives. Does the grace and salvation that we've been given, because we have that same salvation, we have it through Jesus these days, does that then cause us to live and act and be obedient in all things in recognition of that salvation? That make sense? Maybe, maybe not. Let me ask you this. Just back to, and we have teachers in the room and other people. Just from a learner, let's talk about learners for a second. What makes a learner a good one? What are the characteristics that define people? That somebody who's going to learn or be a good student, what do they need to have in their nature to be able to do that?
Listen.
Yeah, they need to be a good listener. They've got to be willing to listen.
Sure, ask good questions.
What you said?
Trust.
Trust. Yeah.
Ask good questions.
Mm-hmm. Good learners ask good questions. That's right.
Apply what they've been taught.
He said inquisitive, and I didn't hear this one.
Apply what they've been taught.
That's a big one, isn't it? You have to apply what you've learned. I mean, that makes the best students.
Gotta put out a little effort.
Has to put forth some effort. Do you hear my mom screaming amen? I told you when you were a kid. I think there's a certain amount of humility, right? Can't be a good learner if we know it all. Not that I've ever been accused of something like that. Thanks for keeping a straight face, ER. I saw you biting your lip.
Be a good learner, you have to be willing and ready to receive knowledge, even though it may be knowledge that you had an idea about that might be wrong.
Did y'all hear that? He said we have to be willing to receive learning in things, even if it's something we already had an idea about, that maybe we were wrong. So humility comes into it.
You have to make some mistakes along the way
Mm-hmm.
to be a good learner.
Mm-hmm. No, you're right. We jokingly call it in my family the bumpy road. Oh, bless it, he's on the bumpy road. Whenever it seems like you take every wrong turn to learn the lesson, it's the story of my life. Yeah. Well, the reason why I ask these questions is, as disciples, right, of Christ, I mean, that's what a disciple was, isn't it? They were just people that followed along in the footsteps of their teacher and tried to learn their ways and then tried to live and follow in those footsteps. And like I said, I mean, there's a lot of good things there. That requires accepting sometimes you were wrong, you've been wrong for a while. Think about who is somebody who was touched by grace and salvation? The most obvious one, Joni and I taught the kindergarten class here a couple of weeks ago. And I wish they were in here because they know the story. And to hear Jet and Eli, and who was it, Riven, and who was the other one? There was one more. But to hear them tell it, it was very interesting about this guy named Saul. And they were like, he was bad. They were serious. He was a bad guy. He wanted to kill them all. I mean, they were telling the story like it was really funny. And they talk about the light coming down, and then God changed his name to Paul, and then he was good. I think about who Saul was. Was there anybody ever in a more prideful, and rightfully so, position? And prideful is not the right word, but a place of esteem among those people. You think about all that he gave up whenever he met true salvation, right? Whenever he saw the light, when all of that took place, and how willing he was to, at an instant, learn his lesson, if you will. Now, did he go on to make some mistakes, and was he maybe a little rough around the edges at times? Maybe so. But you think how changed he was by his encounter with grace and with salvation, and how it changed him all the way. So the thing that scares me about whenever I think about what grace teaches us and how it affects our life and how it should shape literally every piece of our lives, and it should define every bit of our lives, being learners or people who are trying to disciples, following in the footsteps of Jesus, we hope. I always see things one or two ways. I think this is what it's like if we are, but what on earth does it mean if we're not? And I was trying to think through, just through the Bible, and people who had encounters with God who didn't change. You know what I mean? Who's that? Oh, we're going there. We're going to go there in a minute. That's a toughie. She said Judas. We're going to look at Judas in a minute. Here are some other ones. I thought about Pharaoh, but God kind of hardened his heart, didn't he? But many times he was warned. And then how about the children of Israel from that point, and then about every 15 minutes after that? I mean, think about how many times the people of Israel encountered God, encountered salvation. Think of the times they were saved, the odds by which they were saved. Think of all the crazy stories in which they were given victory just because God, and how quickly they turned. And so I always like thinking back through these things, and I like wagging my finger at them. And then I like to sit back and think that's probably me too. Right? I've probably been as guilty. Let's look at a couple of these occasions. And then maybe we'll be done. I understand because Shay told me. She said that later that there's going to be a pie eating contest. She told me that Cub was going to be in a pie eating contest. Yep. And she told me that she was going for Cub unless he's going up against David Kernodle, in which case she's going for David, or if she's going up against Sam, in which case she's rooting for Sam. So people, don't worry. After we talk about this stuff, we'll sit here and we'll get all ready for the pie eating contest. Sam, are you in on that? No? You're pretty wordy tonight, Sam. What is it? Okay. Let's look in Mark. Look in Mark chapter 5. And let's start in verse 1. And there's kind of a parallel account that we look at in Matthew chapter 8. But let's look at this one. I'm thinking about people. Let's think real quick about people who saw salvation and their lives were changed, and you saw the immediate thing. The woman at the well comes to mind, right? She encountered Jesus at the well. She runs to town, and brought back the town. Saul to Paul. There's a lot of places where we read where Jesus would be traveling through, then he would heal a person or do something, and the next time he came through, everybody would be there, and they'd be waiting on him, and they'd be bringing people from all over because they knew he had the power to heal and the power of salvation. This is not one of those times. In chapter 5, verse 1, it says, they came to the other side of the sea, to the country of Gerasenes. That's what I'm going with. That's what Larry said. And when Jesus had stepped out of the boat, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit. He lived among the tombs, and no one could blind him or bind him anymore, not even with chains, for he had often been bound with shackles and chains, but he wrenched the chains apart, and he broke the shackles in pieces. No one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always crying out and cutting himself with stones. And when he saw Jesus from afar, he ran and fell down before him, and crying out with a loud voice, he said, What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjourn you, by God, do not torment me. For he was saying to him, Come out of the man, you unclean spirit. And Jesus asked him, What is your name? He replied, My name is Legion, for we are many. And he begged him earnestly not to send them out of the country. Now a great herd of pigs was feeding there on the hillside. And they begged him, saying, Send us into the pigs and let us enter them. So he gave them permission, and the unclean spirits came out and entered the pigs, and the herd, numbering about 2,000, rushed down the steep bank into the sea, and they drowned in the sea. That is a good vacation Bible school story. Man, we even have a hillside to do this on. Look in verse 14. The herdsmen fled and told it in the city and in the country, and the people came to see what it was that had happened. And they came to Jesus, and they saw the demon-possessed man, the one who had had the legion, sitting there, clothed and in his right mind, and they were afraid. And those who had seen it described to them what had happened to the demon-possessed man and to the pigs. And look at this next verse. And they begged Jesus to depart from their region. We have the same account in Matthew chapter 8, and pretty much says the same thing. When they came out, when they saw the man, when they listened to the stories, they all looked at Jesus and said, Please go now. Isn't that crazy? All right. Well, Richie's not here, and I don't see David Presley either. And this is a really bad example, but this is what I think about whenever I read this story of a wild person who's been tamed. Everything in life equates to an Andy Griffith episode, right? That is true of Richie, isn't it? He kind of likes Andy Griffith. Anyway. What character? Do you remember the fellow that used to come to town to throw rocks in the window, came out of the mountains? Ernest T. Bass. See, you're still awake. Do you remember how wild and crazy he was throwing rocks through the window? I love those episodes. Long ago, I was watching it on Netflix or whatever. They have Andy Griffith, and my kids came in. I was like, You've got to watch this. This is great. And they're like, It's not even in color and all this stuff. And then Shay asked me, Dad, were you alive whenever things weren't in color? And she wasn't talking about TV. She was talking about life. That hurt, all right? Yes, there was color, even on TV. But anyway, Ernest T. Bass would come to town. And he was a wild donkey of a man. Is that the nicest way to say? And chunking rocks through the windows. And you remember that giggle and laugh like a hyena that he did? It's so funny. But the episode that we watched, and my kids, once they saw Ernest T. and all that stuff, they got cracked up. And it was not hard to make them watch the rest of it. They loved it. So Ernest T. runs around, but this particular episode was the one where he came to town and he was throwing rocks and he kept running around town and he was picking up the women as they were doing their shopping. If you remember that one, he'd just go and pick them up. He was looking for a bride. And they need to know how strong he was. He could pick them right up off the ground. Well, I bet you I could pick you up over my head and all that stuff. And so, they take him on, Andy and Aunt B, and then the funniest person ever. What's his name? I can't think of his name. Don Knotts, Barney. And they teach him manners, and they take him to a little social get-together. Do you remember? They have him all slicked up and his hair done, and he was dressed nice, and he danced. That's what he said. Would you like to dance? Then he took that girl outside, and he was like, do you mind if I pick you up? But anyway, I don't know why. It's silly. To compare Ernest T. to this person that had thousands of demons in him. But look, this person was wild and crazy, couldn't be shackled, couldn't be chained. I'm just thinking, cut himself with rocks, was always screaming and hollering. I mean, just think, he was a tormented, demon-possessed person. Think about Ernest T. on steroids, if you will. Think about how wild and crazy this person was. And then think about the people coming out and seeing him sitting, clothed, well-behaved, in his right mind. Can you imagine what that must have been like? In Matthew, it says that people couldn't even pass that way anymore. It was too dangerous because of him. And here he sits. In that episode, there's a part of it where Andy and Barney are standing on the side, and they're watching him at a distance. And they're both just kind of in awe. And they're like, well, isn't that something? Because Andy's like, I think he's going to do it. Look at him. We did pretty good. But could you imagine the shock of seeing this person? There was no doubt something very miraculous took place. Is that how you put it mildly? And a great act of salvation, or a great act of Jesus extending grace to someone, had taken place. That would be enough, I would think, to maybe jar you into thinking, what on earth happened here? And what do I need to do to be a part of it? Or at least to be a good learner, to be inquisitive, to ask good questions, to trust that maybe something went on there. You know, all these things that we as learners, good learners, should do. And that next line in our Bible is so really pretty short and direct and abrupt. And the people saw him, they were amazed, and they asked Jesus to leave the region. Think how much sadness, really, if you think about it, how sad that little line of the Bible is. Just, what have the people, because of their pride or their fear, or just whatever it was that caused them to be unwilling to accept, or not humble enough to recognize and learn that the salvation that they potentially missed right before their eyes, right? I think of that as being one of these scary times where we come face to face with grace or salvation and choose maybe to look away from it. All right. And then Lucille, she chose the other one that I wanted to read tonight. And we're going to leave early. Look in John. Yes. Please.
He asked to go with Jesus.
Then he asked to go with Jesus. That's right.
He asked to be a learner with Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus didn't let him come with him.
He told him to go to his family.
But he became a teacher.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus said, you know, these people that have asked me to leave, you go back to them. You tell them what the Lord has done for you.
Yep.
He quickly transformed himself from a student into a teacher. And God recognized that he could do that and allowed him to help in that ministry. And I think sometimes we miss that. We need to be ready to be a teacher quicker than probably what we ourselves want to be.
I think
we miss that sometimes.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point, because really we see both sides of it. We see the people who saw it and went away, and we saw the person that saw it and experienced it and said, let me come with you. And he said, no, you go home and tell them everything that you saw here and what the Lord has done for you. Weren't the disciples the exact same? Weren't they just ordinary people that were but experienced the Savior and decided to go, yes, sir.
People of the town, have you ever lost 200 head of swine at the same time? Have you ever lost all your hay field in one season? People of the town were hindered from receiving the grace because of finances, money. And that happens to people today.
I lost 4 cows in one lightning strike one time. And it felt like 200 to me. And you're right, when that's the eyes that we see,
It's a lot of swine.
that's a lot of swine. But as a believer, I think that's what the point that Clyde made at the very beginning, having kind of eternal hope or an eternal perspective that we have really comes in handy. But you're right. We can't, they couldn't see past the fleshly trouble in front of them. Look in John chapter 13. Do you remember whenever they go up into the upper room? The first verse, it says, "Now before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart out of this world to the Father, and it says, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end." Now, if we don't read any farther and you don't peek, what did Jesus do next? Remember, they were getting ready for the meal. What did Jesus get up and do, knowing his time had come? He got up, but yeah, he showed them the most excellent way, right? By serving them and by washing their feet. It's an entertaining little thing that happens right through here. Peter says, "You're not going to wash mine." And he says, "If I don't wash your feet, you have no part with me." And then you remember what Peter said next? "How about a bath?" Kind of funny. Jesus had a little hygiene conversation with him for a second. But then he goes on and he serves them, and that he washes their feet. Which, if you just, and I know we talk about that a lot, all us church people, but if you let that soak in a little bit, who these people were, what they had seen Jesus do as they followed him, what they've been able to experience with Jesus, not understanding exactly all that was going on, but could you imagine Jesus getting on the floor to wash your feet and showing them it was an act of kindness. We might even call it an act of grace. Being gracious and kind? Yes, sir. Now, without looking in your Bibles and cheating, mine's on the next page. Do you remember what happens pretty close to right after all of that? They're having the meal together. I love that John so humbly, throws in there. Then the disciple Jesus leaned back and asked him, "Who is it?" Then what happened? Judas, right? And it says that Judas then got up from the table and he left, and Jesus said, "Go and do what you need to be done." Now, this is why there's a lot of reasons why Judas is sad. Really, it's a sad deal. Think back to what we were just talking about. Think of all the things that the disciples had experienced with Jesus. How he'd cared for them, how he'd loved them, how he'd allowed them to learn a lot by stubbing their toe. But he let them learn the things he was entrusting to them. Can you imagine the things that we read about, the things we have Vacation Bible School about? These people witnessed firsthand. And then for Judas then to go and to betray Jesus. That's rough for me to think about. My brother-in-law, we were talking about it this morning, and he was kind of talking about it a little more in depth than I have. And I was like, really, it's an awful thing to think that somebody could have witnessed and experienced the salvation of God that close and the grace and all these things this closely to then to betray that. That shows you the power of what the devil can do to you for sure. It's rough for me to think about that for Judas, because the Bible says some really hard things right in through there. That it would be better for this man to have not been born and different things like that, which seems pretty rough. But I think it's one thing to talk about those things, and kind of why I worry about with myself whenever I think about, okay, this is what it's like to be a learner, but what is a bad learner? Well, like I told you, I've taken the bumpy road. I spend a lot of my time bumping the head on the wall. I can't tell you how many times I've had to sit in my life and go, why do these same things why do I have to keep dealing with these same things over and over and over? I know none of you probably have ever had to do that, but I do it regularly. There's a specific thing that was just, and I was talking to my brother about today. I think I was probably about 30, 32-ish. I was in my early 30s. Before, I think maybe I was humble enough, or I don't know, maybe just beat up enough to say, you know what, Lord, there's obviously something that I'm not getting. I'm not being a very good learner here. Maybe would you show me what that is? Right? And so it's easy to point my finger at Judas, and it's easy to point our finger at the town that ran away, and even the people of Israel and all that stuff. Like I said, I like to do a lot of finger wagging, but it's not very hard to do a little finger wagging at myself either. The times that I have been just not a very good learner or disciple or follower of Jesus. When I sit and think about God's grace, when I think about the salvation that He has given me through Jesus' obedience, right? And that grace that extends to us from there. And I think about there's really not a single point in our life, in my life, let me say that is not affected by God's grace and salvation. And if there is, there sure shouldn't be. Hopefully I'm to the point where I want to be a learner. That's one thing I have learned, is that the older I get, the less I know. Right? But God's grace, hopefully it just teaches us. I hope, my desire is that we will be people that learn, that are touched and affected by God's grace, that are affected by the salvation we have through Jesus, and that we let that affect every single piece of our life and move forward. I do not want to be one that doesn't learn. This morning, Joni sent out a text on one of our family chats and said, hey, we're talking about grace at church. Does anybody have anything about grace? Tell whatever. And so the family's kind of sending stuff. And I didn't write down, Joni's sister Monica sent this. She said, this is one of my favorite quotes about grace. And I forgot, it was from an author, and I forgot the author's name. So credit to some author out there. And it says, I do not understand all the mystery of grace. I only know that it meets us where we are, but it doesn't leave us where it found us. I like that. Man, I like that. Isn't it good to know that even in our sin and wherever we are, that Jesus meets us and saves us? Now, whether we stay there or whether we learn to move forward kind of becomes up to us. Like I said, my prayer is that we learn, that we allow grace to teach us as we move forward. Okay, I'm done. Robert, will you pray for us so that Cub can eat pie?